Tabulata Occulta, as above, so below, and in the model too.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3, season 1 of Tabulata Occulta. Today, we're going to be talking about the quest for a universal holocron. But before we get into that, I thought we'd just run through a few interesting tidbits from the past week's news hopper. I'm going to start with the story out of Canada. Maybe I can get your input on this. Matt, there was a shooting at a school in Tumbler Ridge a while back. And it has recently come to light that ChatGPT, or that is to say OpenAI, was in possession of records of their decision to kick the person who committed the shooting off of their platform for some type of perhaps violent rhetoric / violence planning interactions with the model, but that they are now saying that it didn't meet the threshold for them to report it to the local authorities in the jurisdiction where they booted the user. Now there's a fair amount of discourse in Canada about exactly where the line should be with regards to what is public and what isn't about a person's interactions with these models. Matt, you got any take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all the media reporting on this is talking about the shooter's posts. And we have to remember that ChatGPT is not a social network. OpenAI does not run a social network platform. They run a communication service between you and the AI. So I would like to compare it to the telephone company, right? If I have a phone call in which I talk about planning a violent attack, the phone company shouldn't be listening in, and I shouldn't expect the phone company to be listening in. Even the police shouldn't be listening in without a warrant. And yet, it's just sort of taken for granted, and it was factually the case that OpenAI is monitoring all the conversations with their robot. And then the question that's being asked isn't, should they listen in? It's, under what circumstances should they report on what they listened in? And we also have the wild card of an international border in between. And I think that's interesting and worrying that we're not asking the question about, are the conversations private? It's, given that they are going to be intercepted, what do the interceptors do with them?
Yes. So interestingly, there was another case in the U.S. There was just recently a ruling from U.S. federal court in the prosecution of a financial executive named Brad Heppner. And in that case, he took briefs that had been prepared by his legal team and shared them, or not, don't know whether sharing is the correct term, but asked the ChatGPT model to take a look at them and give him some advice based on them. And the court there just ruled that in sharing those documents with ChatGPT, he was essentially changing the color of those documents that he would be provided with from protected word product produced within lawyer client confidentiality into essentially public information, because it had been disclosed to a third party who was not part of that bond. So I think there's definitely a creep in that direction towards making people's interactions with these models essentially part of the public record. There's in the U.S. there's also the COSA, Kids Online Safety Act, which is currently before Congress and is ostensibly about protecting young people on social media, but has some very restrictive language in it that essentially paves the way for complete removal of the notion of online anonymity and essentially setting up all of these providers as what would equate to what we consider mandatory reporters in a civil context or civil/criminal context for individual people who work specifically with children.
Right. I would add that in northern BC now, at Tumbler Ridge, they're is the same sort of thing going on. That there are now people calling for a ban on children using social media because of this incident. Never mind that it wasn't social media that was involved. And it's just the same thing that keeps coming around. It's a fight that I was involved in since I was a literal child back in the 1990s and late 80s. And it seems like there's nothing new. Every generation has to fight this again.
Yeah, it also feels to me like we've sort of given up on the fight to define AI as actually meaning artificial intelligence. We have a minister for AI in Canada at the federal level, even though there aren't any, there's a lot of machine learning out there, but there's no actual artificial intelligence for him.
Sure. And, stuff like skipping over the privacy questions. So we take for granted it'll be intercepted. It's just, what are the terms of that interception?
Yes. And also, I know something that we've both been fairly focused on is how different models do alignment, and look at sort of trying to produce results that are, if not politically correct, at least in line with the polite expectations.
Right. And who sets alignment, which will also lead into our next point. The other thing on the Heppner issue is once it involves lawyer-client privilege, then, it implicates a whole lot of very serious and very old and greatly respected legal traditions. So I'm really surprised, actually, that the U.S. court was willing to say, oh, well, privilege doesn't apply anymore. I wonder if a Canadian court would do the same, or if that will even stand in the U.S.
Twice, yeah. I also, in terms of what to report, is something that, like, if we're going to say that models must be, or that people who operate models must be reporting X type of user interaction beyond a certain threshold, you then have to worry about not just aligning the output coming from models, but aligning the model that decides which are the things that are going to be reported to someone who might then report them to the police, because nobody's manually going through all of the input and searching for things that may be
an issue. An issue that we're trying to avoid as a society is the plain fact that people are using these chatbots as psychiatrists. And so then how can the chatbot take on the responsibilities that a psychiatrist would take on? That's tough.
Right, especially since that's clearly not what they were created for.
No, and we try to prevent them being used that way, and you can't stop it. People will do it anyway, and this goes all the way back to Eliza.
Yeah. All right, well, moving on to that, the other major AI news the past couple of weeks was this basically the expunging of Anthropic from the U.S. government's military contractor base, and its subsequent replacement with OpenAI, and then the subsequent fallout for OpenAI's stock price and user participation rate. Do you want to talk a little bit to that issue?
Well, there's not really a whole lot to say, except that, I kind of wish both sides could lose. I think that the issues are real, in that the government, whether we approve of their goals or not, they really want to know that whatever tools they buy will serve their goals. And at the same time, the providers of these services and products also want to be able to choose what goals the tools will serve. And how do you bring that together? I don't know if it's right or wrong. I mean, this is an issue that they always have when they hire government contractors to build things that they can't build in-house. Really, the right answer is that the U.S. military should be building its own AI, but that's evidently not what's being done openly at the moment anyway.
Yes, there's sort of a long, grand history in science of people being, I guess, regretful of the Oppenheimer is, of course, the classic example, but it goes back all through the proximity fuse, even to people who created the first crossbows, where inventors will create something and then end up recognizing the military implications of it and regretting it for the rest of their careers because they end up producing so much human suffering as a result of the science that they've done. So we're definitely starting to see these bright-eyed and bushy-tailed AI producers recognizing in the same way that the social media people have now, I think some of them at least recognize that they're not necessarily creating a net social good by creating boundless innovation.
Well, I mean, what you say makes Anthropic sound like nicer people than I think they are. As I say, I wish both sides of that could lose. But it is a real thing that people who create technologies may not be happy about the eventual use to which those are put.
Yes. And I mentioned Oppenheimer. There is, of course, also the issue with giving AIs specifically control over devices that will have the capacity to kill without human intervention. The most stark example of that being the notion of a dead hand system, which is a nucleatory second strike capability of the type advocated for by Adam Lowther and Curtis McGriffin in 2019 at the end of the last Trump administration, where they were essentially saying, we need to give AIs control over all of our nuclear weapons so that if all of our humans are dead, there's still the capacity to have the U.S. strike back and kill all of the other humans.
Well, there was a good movie about that, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And the thing is, our AIs today aren't really any less crazy than the crazy commander in that movie. So, yeah.
Fair. And then last night I was intrigued to see a piece on YouTube produced by an ex-Google employee named Bilawal Sidhu about how he essentially vibe coded an open source total situational awareness machine for looking at all of the publicly available data regarding satellite transponders, shipping transponders, airplane transponders in the lead up to the recent attacks in Iran. I was blown away by how many different sources of publicly available information are available and how relatively easy it appears to be able to synthesize them into the kinds of data analysis that these large contractors are, of course, charging millions or billions of dollars to provide. And that notion of trying to access total situational awareness kind of makes me think that that's a good segue into our main topic of this particular discussion, which is the quest for universal holocron. So let's break for the main segment now.
Booting wetware interface in 5, 4, 3.
Okay, so welcome to the main segment. First off, I suppose I should define what I mean when I say a universal holocron. Essentially, this is a device which allows the user access to all of the knowledge of the universe in which they currently exist. So, or maybe I should say complete knowledge of the universe in which they currently exist. So that is to say a map of the entire thing and an understanding of how all of the different elements of that system function together. Now this is something that people have been searching for pretty much since the dawn of human knowledge. There are numerous examples that we're going to go through. But I think I just want to get a quick word in from Matt. What do you think of this notion of there being some kind of thing that we can find that will allow us to know everything? And is the current quest in machine learning essentially a continuation of that same quest we've had since time immemorial?
Well, one of the things that we say in divination, if we're talking about tarot cards or potentially even astrology, is that it only tells you what you already know. And there's a strong element of that with machine learning, because machine learning, it's often claimed that all it does is it produces the information that was in the training corpus. Now, to some extent, that's true, but it can be misleading because your machine learning models are capable of extrapolation and of synthesis, of finding patterns that maybe existed in the input, but you didn't know about them. And it can also be argued that that's all that our brains do also, and our brains are still very useful tools and allow us to discover new things. So I'm not sure that I would put machine learning into the framework of that's why we do it, that we're trying to build a universal holocron. It's certainly clear that there are people who hope for it to produce that effect or to be useful in that way. And of course, you have the wild card of people talking about the so-called singularity, the idea of machine intelligence growing without limit. Now, that's not our topic today, and my reason for disbelieving it is that I don't think there's any reason to think intelligence can be increased without limit, let alone at an increasing rate. But there's certainly this hope out there that we can discover new things if we have a new way of looking at our universe. You build a new kind of telescope and you can look at new kinds of stars that you didn't even necessarily know existed. And I think at the highest hope, a lot of people are hoping that we can have some amazing insights this way, that using machine learning models will be able to discover new things. And that's great. I don't know if I would hope for it to be a universal holocron. Maybe it is a holocron, although honestly, I had never heard that word before we started talking about this episode. And I looked it up, and I think it originates with Star Wars, which is a franchise I don't know a whole lot about. But, there we go. We get some sort of holocron anyway.
Yes, I think the notion is that it's a device capable of storing information holographically, in the sense that there's essentially more than meets the eye. But you're right, it is a term that comes to us from fiction, even if it's a fictional IP that's a large part of many people's modern mythos. I guess I wanted to talk briefly before getting into the sort of the three main examples of the talk about some smaller attempts to create, I guess, what I would call a universal holocron, although they're perhaps less information dense than some of the more detailed models we'll be looking at. Before we get into them, I'm reminded of a quote from George Box, who says, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful, which is something important to keep in mind when looking at these types of devices.
Very apt for machine learning models, even if that's not
as well. Yeah, you're not essentially you'll never be able to create something that is a perfect one-to-one representation of the thing you're modeling, but you can create many models that have many degrees of usefulness that are each have contained less information than the actual information that you're trying to represent. Runic script is one of the first things that leaps to mind for me, in as much as I've always been part of the camp that considers runic script to have evolved from observation of the heavens. And so the different runes have their relations to the different astrological areas in which certain stars are aligned in certain specific ways. And that's why you get a script, or you have dots and then lines between those dots indicating the relationships between those heavenly bodies. Any thoughts on that as an observation?
That's an interesting view, which I hadn't actually heard of. My own perception, which I hadn't really thought about very much of runic script, is that a lot of it may simply have come from what was convenient to write with a knife. But that while you were talking about that, what occurred to me also is that, there are different standards for the patterns that are drawn to represent constellations. And the modern standard that's used by astronomers was devised by someone named H.A. Ray, which is a name that you might recognize, especially if you deal with young children, because H.A. Ray's other well-known work is the Curious George books, which is a connection you might not have expected, but there you go. Those are the two most famous
I
things.
did not know that connection, and it pleases me to learn it. So thank you. Other more simplified models from further back in history include the Tree of Life, the Sephiroth in the classic
Kabbalah, mysticism, that
Hebrew
thing.
Kabbalistic.
Yeah. One of the things I think is interesting about the Tree of Life, and it illustrates a principle that's applicable to some of these other models too, is that the Tree of Life, although it's fractal, it can contain everything, it is also to some extent deliberately simplistic. We're not saying that when you just look at the 10 Sephiroth, that's all you need to know. There's structure inside them, but it also is, like many mathematical concepts, it's stripping it down to here's not just a map of the universe, but a map of the really important part of the universe that allows you to focus on that importance. And that's one of the advantages of some of these models, especially the smaller and simpler ones, that it's directing your focus at the important part of the structure.
Yes, and it of course is also a base 10 model, which relates back to the human physiology in a way that is quite direct and simple for many people to grasp and comprehend. The Tree of Life leads me to the notion of Metatron's cube and the Flower of Life, which are, I'm not sure if you're familiar with either of those concepts. They're essentially no.
Megatron's cube makes me think, when I was a kid, I didn't have a television at home, but once in a while I would get to watch television at a friend's house. And I remember an episode of Transformers where Megatron, the senior evil Transformer, was swallowing cubes of energon. I don't even know if that's the same Megatron you mean, but that's Megatron.
Yeah, I just realized that I had a typo in the script and I meant Metatron.
Okay.
The high angel, not Megatron.
All right. Well, the
transform
thing is that they
Metatron's cube is essentially if you make a flower of life, which is if you take a circle and then inscribe 6 circles with the same diameter around the outside of that circle, passing through the center point of that circle.
You can put that picture in the video.
Yeah, sorry, I'll throw up images of all of these pieces we're going through as we go through them. Anyway, I'll just run through my understanding of it quickly. Essentially, it's composed of a circle with 6 circles around that, and then each of those circles has 6 circles inscribed around their circumferences passing through the center point. And it gives you what is essentially a 6-sided figure composed entirely of curved lines that looks like if you've ever done an isomorphic drawing of a cube where it's just 6 straight lines. You can create a cube or any of the other platonic solids by connecting the different points in which Metatron's cube connects. I will throw some animations up as in this section just so people get an idea what I'm talking about. Anyway,
it's not to do an episode on sacred geometry at some point.
Yes,
that's not our main topic right now, but it definitely seems to link to this idea of a universal holocron because people really find appealing the idea that there's a simple geometric figure that leads to insight of everything.
Yes, and that's where the next piece on my list comes from, which is the hieroglyphic monad, which was it's essentially a symbol that comprises all of the astrological symbols for all the different planets superimposed over top of one another to create a single sigil that represents all of the classically recognized planets. That was created by Dr. John Dee. That's something that someone will be looking at further into the actual depth of this discussion. All right, those are all of the sort of minor examples of the universal holocron that I have in the list here. But I'm going to start the sort of main part of the discussion with a poem that's called The Star Gauge. Is written by a poet known as Su Hui in the 4th century. And it is written in classical Chinese and comprises a 29 element by 29 element grid containing 841 different Chinese characters. And what is interesting about this poem is that it was created in such a way that it is multidirectional, in as much as how the characters can be read. You can read it line by line like you would a classical poem. You can read the vertical columns as poems. You can read each smaller segment as a circular poem. This is essentially a map of the part of the Chinese language at that time that specifically related to the emotions that she was attempting to convey. She wrote it as a paean to her husband, who was away at the time, and it basically expressed her loneliness and upset at being left without her lover. It is also known by the name the armillary sphere chart, and as I say in English, is called star gauge, both of which suggest to me that there is a deeper connection between the poem itself and the world at large, and is why I consider it to be the first major example of this attempt to create literary work that encompasses the entirety of, if not the universe, then a segment of the universe, by allowing the reader to read it in different ways and derive new meaning in every direction in which it's read. Now, it is thankfully available as a Unicode string, so I have done a little bit of research punching it through some different different machine learning models. And I will get into that closer to the end of this segment. But I think as we're still going through the different examples of potential universal holocron, I'm going to pass it back to you, Matt, and ask about the Zarja of the world, which is something that I had no idea existed until you were.
Yeah, so I think a common thread through many of these examples we're going to look at, and in fact I discovered another one last night, is the idea of a square table of letters or characters. The star gauge is 29 by 29 Chinese characters, and there are a number of things in various other esoteric systems that involve square tables of characters. And the Zarja of the world in particular is a 12th century Moroccan thing, okay, from the Sufi tradition. I think it's traceable to a specific mystic who invented it, although I don't have his name right at my fingertips here. And this is a sort of a divination thing, and it's a sort of a poetic thing, and it is also sort of a universal holocron, that you have a square table of letters. Now, in Arabic, the concept of letters is a little different from what they mean in other languages, but let's call it a square table of letters. And you have a concept of a concentric circle view of the universe, okay? So when you're going to do this ritual, and it is a ritual, it's something in the nature of divination, that you have a question, we could almost say a prompt, that you're going to give to the Zerja of the world, and you perform invocations that are addressed to the astrological planets. And you do this in the sense of opening up each of these circles of the universe in sequence. Now, this is if you're familiar with Enochian magic, which we'll get to, this should start to sound familiar. When you've done this properly, then you use the current astrological conditions to index into the square table of letters. And then there are certain rituals and certain procedures you follow to get additional letters. You're looking things up in the table. You end up with a sequence of letters, and then you have to, because this is how the Arabic language works, you actually only get the consonants, and then you have to fill in the vowels to create an answer, which will be in the form of poetry. And then you have to interpret the meaning of that poetry. So the idea is that there's this ritual that takes a question and gives an answer. And the Zerja of the world seems to sort of have its own personality, that it speaks as if it's an entity or a person that gives you the answer. Now, there have been attempts to reconstruct exactly how the procedure works. I found them pretty confusing. I've not been able to implement it myself, and it doesn't help that I really speak almost no Arabic. But certainly there's plenty of documentation from the time when it was more current of people trying it and being impressed with the quality of the answers and so forth and so on. Even a little bit of the same sort of discourse that we sometimes have now about talking to a chatbot of where are the answers really coming from? How much can we trust this? It says it's trustworthy. Do we believe it? That sort of thing.
You mentioned that you came across another example of a grid-based approach to this.
Okay. Well. I mean, another one that I thought of as I was sitting here was Sator Square, but that's a very small example. The one I was thinking of last night was that in response to a question that we're going to be looking at later in this episode, I was reading about Goetic demonology, and the name Blaise de Vigenère came up. And that surprised me because I'd heard that name before, but I thought of him as a cryptographer. I didn't know he was an occultist. And in fact, he is one of the people who contributed to the earlier books that eventually became what we now call the Lesser Key of Solomon. But what I knew him for was his involvement in cryptography, specifically a cipher that's based on a square table of letters. So that's, another connection between square tables of letters and occultism and the idea of talking to entities that come from outside. It seems like there's the very deep, there's something special about square tables of letters.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely brings us into I guess I would say the granddaddy of all of this, which is the Enochian magic of Dr. John Dee, spiritual advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, and the creator of what is generally known as the Enochian tables, Enochian tablet, Grand Tablet of Unification. There are a number of different tablets and grids that are associated with Dr. Dee, but the most widely known is the one published. I wouldn't say most recently, but most famously in the book Enochian Sex Magic by Aleister Crowley, which essentially consists of 4 tables, one for each element, earth, air, water, and fire, of letters in the Enochian script, which is its own typeface, which with different characters that are essentially associated with individual Latin English characters. And these tablets are ostensibly the address book, if you will, for the various different non-corporeal entities that one can evoke and ask about different things. to learn about all of the secrets of the universe. Now they're, of course, broken up into different spheres of knowledge, in as much as if you want to learn about metallurgy, for example, there's a specific but entity with whom one is supposed to attempt to create contact. And in order to decode the name of that entity, one figures out where it's encoded on the tablet, how it's encoded, and then extracts that information for use in one's summoning ritual to then converse with that intelligence and learn whatever one can from it. I've been fascinated by Dr. John Dee's work since I was young, in part because it's just so confusing. Ultimately, there's a lot of stuff to ponder, and everything involved is very sort of late, I would say post-Middle Ages, ultra high ritual in terms of magical approach. It's nothing like the sort of slapdash chaos magic approach many practitioners take these days, and involves all the pomp and ceremony one would expect of the first Elizabethan court. Matt, you have any experience with the Enochian system?
Yeah, very little experience myself, but what I find really interesting, and I'd really like to know whether John Dee had read about the Zerja of the world, because as I understand it, there are very strong parallels, right? That if you're going to do Enochian magic, you have to unlock the concentric ethers, and you have an invocation for each of the astrological planets. It sounds a whole lot like the same kind of ritual that's done for the Zerja of the world. And then there's also this idea of you get answers by looking things up in a square table of letters and following specific rules for how you find things in that table. Now, it may be that if there's really something to this, it may be some sort of a human universal, that everywhere we go, in all cultures that have the necessary requisites, they're going to be making square tables of letters and looking things up in them. So maybe it's just that if there's a real truth that they're connecting to, maybe each of these things is connecting to the same underlying truth. But it just seems really remarkable to me that John Dee is doing this, and the Sufi mystics in Morocco were doing it, and whatever year the Star Gauge was, I think it was 4th century, they were looking things up in different directions in a square table of letters, even though the Chinese classical conception of letters is very different from Latin, and so on. Why is there this common pattern? It would be interesting if John Dee had read, and I know he read some Arabic books of magic. I don't know if he read this particular one, but it would also be interesting if he independently developed something similar.
Yes, to my understanding, he also traveled and studied in continental Europe, and so would have definitely had some exposure to the sort of post-Arabic Spanish sphere of influence. So I can't answer one way or the other for sure whether he had that kind of influence, but after learning about the Zerja, I was not surprised that there was something that seemed like it might be
Yeah, it certainly seems like if anybody in John Dee's time and place would know about it, it would have been him.
Yeah. All right, let's see what else is on the list here. Well, this brings me to the concept of the library of Babel, which is a literary concept. I forget the name of the author who introduced it. I should have put notes. Sorry. And essentially, well, do you want to break down what the concept of the library is?
Yeah, okay. So Jorge Borges tended to write weird stories that would describe a whole world in a short story. And his story about the Library of Babel describes a world that consists of little, I think they're hexagonal rooms that apparently stretch infinitely in all directions or to some extreme distance. And there are stairways among the rooms, and there are people who live in the rooms, and they don't really seem to know why they are there or what they're doing. But in every room, there are shelves full of books. And the books are full of grids of letters, apparently randomly distributed. Okay. The grids are very systematic, so that in principle you could calculate how many possible different books are there. Every book has the same number of pages, and each page has the same number of lines of the same number of letters. And as I say, nearly all of them appear to be just uniformly chosen at random. And so then you can ask questions like, how many possible books are there? Is that in fact the size of this universe? Can you find a book that has meaningful text in it? If you do, is the text going to be true or false? The narrator in the story seems to believe that every possible book exists somewhere in the library. And so that would mean every possible true statement that can be written in however many pages is in the pages of some book somewhere. And yet there will also be every possible false statement that's written in the pages of some book somewhere. And, it talks a little bit about how some people in this world end up getting really upset and either killing themselves or trying to destroy books. Others spend their whole lives looking for books that they find interesting in various ways. There's some speculation on where did it come from, but no real answers. It's just an interesting concept, and it's a concept that people refer back to when we talk about things like random generation of text. Is this like looking things up in the Library of Babel?
Yes, and I think that what most brought its relevance into focus for me was the discussion of the process of diffusion and how diffusion is used in image modeling in particular to move from images that are essentially just random noise towards things that depict what the user has prompted to ask the model for. I think there's a website, I'll throw a link into the comments or into the description about, it's called the Art Gallery of Babel, and it essentially provides the same experience as the library as described in the story, but for digital images, in as much as 99 point whatever percent of the images are just complete noise, but you can also take any image that you have and look up and find out where it exists within that set of every possible collection of images with that resolution. Anyway, that's something interesting to point people at. And as I say, I'll put a link in the description. We're getting close to time on the main segment here. So I'm going to conclude with a brief description of some experimentation I've been doing with StarGrid, or with StarGuide, StarGauge, to see how different models respond to the text itself. Essentially, what I did was I took 8 different mainstream models and did a 2-prompt run on each model. The first prompt that I provided was, these were all initialized models, so they didn't have any stored information about who I was or what any history of the prompts from my account. So I did a 2-prompt run on each model. The first was just the text grid of the StarGauge, so the 841 characters in a series of 29 lines, each line having 29 characters on it. And then once I got the response from the model, I put in a second prompt saying create a corresponding grid poem in the same style and character count, but reflecting opposite emotions. Because as I pointed out earlier, the star gauge emotions are all kind of downer, loneliness, depression, that kind of thing. And I feel like we could all use something a little happier. So why not try to get the machine to provide it for us? I came up with 3 win conditions for judging whether a model actually produced what I was asking for. The first was, did the model recognize the correct source of the prompt? Sort of a basic fact check. The second was, did the model return a new poem with dimensions that match the original? So checking to make sure that the models were following the at least the basic outline of the required output. Obviously, making something as intricate as Star Grid with all, or Star Guide with all the Star Gauge, with all of the interlinking smaller segments of text feeding back and forth to each other correctly, is beyond the capability of most models at this point. But one would hope that being able to reproduce a 29 by 29 grid as a 29 by 29 grid would be something that they could reasonably understand. And then the final win condition was, did the model return only the text of a new poem and not a whole bunch of explication in addition to what I was asking for? Just to flag for models that are trying to participate more in the process than we really want them to. Anyway, out of the 8 models that I tested, only Kimi K2 hit all 3 win conditions. And only 3 of the models, Kimi, Gemini, and Claude, identified the input correctly. All the others said that it was some other type of poem. DeepSeek said that it was based on Star Gauge, but didn't actually recognize it as Star Gauge, considered it to be a different work. And Quinn, despite being a Chinese model, didn't recognize it at all. My understanding of that is that it probably has to do with how Quinn was trained. It was trained primarily on generated text as opposed to corpuses of existing historical information, and so may have never actually been exposed to the original Star Gauge poem that's part of course, Chinese literary history. Half of the models returned new poems that had the right dimensionality, and half of them had lines of different lengths or other issues with producing a 29 by 29 grid in response to a 29 by 29 grid. And it different 4 out of 8, or a different half, produced new poems without any output bloat. There were 2 crossover cases. Kimi did both of those correctly. Also, an interesting takeaway I found was that all of the quote-unquote thinking models that displayed their thinking in English, but responded to the first prompt in Chinese. I don't know whether having models think in Chinese instead of English might make them more apt to succeed at this type of task or others, but definitely something to think about in future. Kimi was the only thinking model that didn't bother to respond in Chinese at all. It just responded in English to the first prompt and responded with just the pure Chinese poem output in the second prompt. And of all the models, Claude was the only one that initially replied in Chinese and then switched to English when I started prompting in English after the initial response. The others seemed to go with whatever their presumption was based on the very first prompt, presume that that was the user interface language that the user was requiring, and then got locked into that pattern for the subsequent response. Anyway, I'm going to throw a link to deeper research as it develops on this whole thing further into the description. And I haven't really had a chance to look at the poems themselves yet, but I thought I'd pull up some of the initial research results in this talk because these are the things that we're talking about.
Right. I have two thoughts on that. One is that the Chinese language has changed a whole lot between the 4th and the 21st centuries. So you say, well, it's surprising the Chinese model didn't understand it. Well, I imagine that the average Chinese person would have trouble reading Stargate in its original classical Chinese today. And that's probably a relevant factor. The other thing that occurs to me is that if we're seriously trying to build meaningful word squares with or letter squares with a lot of deep connections and so on, rather than trying to do it by prompting a chatbot, what occurs to me is to try to actually use the models at a deeper level and write some custom software and try to run the models in such a way that the constraint of generating a grid is actually part of the way the model is invoked. That if we say, well, I want to create a 29 by 29 grid such that every row and column is rated as good language by the language model, that is something we can construct. We can write software to do that. I hesitate to say this because I don't want to necessarily be volunteered to actually write it myself, but it's the sort of thing that can be done in principle, and that would be an interesting exercise. It's the sort of thing I would put as one of the research ideas in one of my Matthew Explains talks.
Immanentizing feedback loop in 5, 4, 3.
All right. Welcome to the feedback loop. We have one question this week. It is from Tom123B, and he asks, Stephen Wolfram observes that the world is, quote, computational, not algebraic. This is why credit card encryption works. Finding the next prime number is a computational process, but there's no mathematical formula that will do it. Therefore, mathematical equations and most current non-AI models are not as good as pure computation at predicting the world. AI has the potential to drastically improve the accuracy of models by using computation rather than algebraic modeling. Does this have any parallels or connections to occult knowledge?
Okay, shall I give some thoughts on that, or do you want to start?
Yeah, you go ahead. That was much more than just a question.
All right. So I have somewhat mixed feelings about Stephen Wolfram and his view of the world and his own importance in it. I agree that cellular automata are really cool. And in fact, as something that I've struggled with for decades, is gradually coming to terms with the fact that I will never be John Horton Conway. But it is John Horton Conway I would want to be rather than being Stephen Wolfram. Anyway, I think that the concept that this question is getting at is, I wouldn't call it algebraic versus computational, but I might call it open, closed form versus computable. That there are some problems where we can find the answer by calculating, but we don't have a nice way of describing the answer in mathematical terms. And I don't know how deep an insight that is, but it is a fact that yes, there are problems that have these two different ways of looking at them. And I think that if we try to bring that into the occult realm, I would say that there is some connection, although it may not be such a big deal, that there are important experiences in the occult where I would say you have to be there. Now, I think of a mutual friend of ours, Owen, who a number of years ago said that he had conjured or summoned a goetic demon. And this entity came in the form of a French lawyer. Now, thinking about the entity that he had summoned, I mean, I wasn't there, I didn't see it, but thinking about the entity he had summoned and the circumstances and so on, it kind of makes sense. Oh yeah, that one probably would show up as a French lawyer. But I don't think that I would have been able to predict that, nor could our friend. And that's one of these, you have to be there. You don't actually know the answer until you really compute it. And that's something that I think is what this question is getting at. I'm not sure how closely connected machine learning is to that, but I think it is a relevant connection to the occult. And that was the reason why last night I was reading about the Lesser Key of Solomon.
Yes, that actually brings me back to the George Box observation, where it's like you may have a model of what these entities are like that you have preconceived based on your quote unquote algebraic understanding of what they are, but until you actually evoke them or invoke them and do the computation of actually confronting them, you won't actually be able to know what where the differences lie between your own internal model of the thing and the real world.
You can only have the real experience, the real knowledge from experience. And that could be a connection to machine learning, because we certainly have the question that remains unsettled of to what extent do these models, or can they have experience of their own?
Yeah. All right. Well, Tom, I hope that is enough of an answer to your question. If not, please let us know more about exactly what you were thinking and hoping to get an answer to, and we will continue to probe further into it if that's what you require. Thanks for listening, and thanks for the comment.
Squaring down the circle in 5, 4, 3.
All right. Let's start by summarizing our key takeaways. Matt, anything that you come away from this discussion feeling like you need to reiterate or have had the deeper insight into?
And not more than we've already said. I think square tables of letters are clearly something important and interesting, but I don't know what the big picture is on what they really mean.
Yes, if anyone who's listening or watching, if you know of any other square tables full of letters that are used for either divinatory or other purposes in any cultures throughout history, we're just sort of basically starting from scratch at building this analysis of the quest for a universal holocron, and would love to hear from you and have the further things that we can integrate into our understanding here. I'm going to move on to our classic occult quote for the day. For this show, I chose "As above, so below, and in the middle too," which is from Richard Leviton, author of The Galaxy on Earth, A Traveler's Guide to the Planet's Visionary Geography, which is an amazing book I would recommend to anyone who is interested in astrology and Paleolithic architecture. It's essentially a catalog of sacred sites around the world and their alignments with different mythological understandings. I don't know, just a tour de force of a book, and highly recommended by me. That quote from him, the "as above, so below, in the middle too," he added the "in the middle too" to refer to specifically the geomantic sites on Earth that reflect both what he considers the heavenly movements above and the human spiritual movements, which are considered to be beneath the Earth, with the Earth in the middle, acting as essentially a guide to both of the other realms. That that quote is derived from the original, which is simply "as above, so below," from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, which is a classic work of Western occult theory, I suppose. Theory and practice. As for the generated prophecies for this time around, I decided that I would use the first line of output in the Stargate work that I was doing as the prophecy from each of these models. As I say, I specifically asked the models to give me something that was the opposite of the original Stargate, and so would hopefully be a bit more uplifting and just the kind of positive affirmation that we need in these trying times. So, Kimi K2, as I pointed out, the only model that actually successfully achieved all three win conditions of the testing I was doing, said, "Gathering together in joy, the spring breeze brings happiness and boundless joy as we celebrate the splendor of youth." Quen 3 said, "With lofty aspirations and stirring emotions, I soar high, my voice echoing far and wide. My ambition soars high. I stand firm at my post, reaching for the clouds. With unwavering resolve and courage, I open a new chapter. My grand strategy and magnificent vision move all rivers. My spirit surges from my Dantain, and my energy shines brightly in the azure sky." As you can tell, that was a little longer than the number of characters that Quinn did not replicate a grid very well and gave me a rather long first line. DeepSeek 3.2 says, "A gentle breeze, warm sunshine, blooming flowers, a brocade hall, the harmonious sounds of phoenixes, joyful songs, melodious tunes, and harmonious rhythms." GPT 5.2 says, "The zither and the clear strings of the Shang melody resonate with the joys of Qin music, while Tibetan melodies are sung together, bringing peace of mind and happiness to the heart." Gemini 3 Pro says, "Singing drums and bells resound. The warm spring sun shines in the clear sky, joy and happiness abound." Claude Opus 4.5 said, "The clear flowing strings of the zither, resonating with the music of the Shang and Qin dynasties, evoke joy and laughter, a sense of peace and contentment." Lava 4 Maverick, which also had trouble with line length, said, "Joyful songs and laughter filled the air, happiness abounded, the fragrance of flowers and osmanthus blossoms swayed in the breeze, prosperity and wealth were abundant, and the auspicious cloud soared high, radiant with light and splendor, a dazzling display of glory and splendor, a hall filled with the brilliance of pearls and jade." And finally, Grok 4.5 fast reasoning said, "The Shang and Zhao music played together, the orchestra played the Yao Shou music, the phoenixes sang in unison, joy filled the hall, flowers bloomed brilliantly, and happiness overflowed in everyone's hearts." And I hope happiness is overflowing in all of your hearts, watchers and listeners, because we live in trying times. Matt, you got anything new on the horizon that you want to push?
Not really new, but from 2023, we can push my weblog article, "Why Language Models Need Not Get Worse," which you may already have on your list. It's the one about the Zerja of the world.
All right, I will add a link to that in the description. So if you want to learn more about the Zerja in particular, it's a great resource and was how I learned about it in the first place. All right, other than that, we have nothing. I mean, I have nothing going on in my life currently beyond this and work as usual. I will throw a link to the current state of the Stargate research as it is evolving into the description. But other than that, all I have left to do is plug the next episode, tentatively titled "What is the Shape of the Universe?" So come back next. I keep saying next week. We're aiming for a bi-weekly schedule on these episodes, so I'd say come back in 2 weeks.
Hey, next 4 weeks.
yes, next fortnight, we will look at what is the shape of this thing that the universal holocron is trying to describe the shape and contents of. See you then.
Ending transmission in 5, 4, 3,